Hello, FasCats. This is Coach Andrew here with Coach Ricky. Today we're going to be talking about how to optimize your 2025 race calendar, as well as some of the mistakes that Ricky and I made when we were kind of coming up through the ranks. Welcome, Ricky.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for having me. I think we should point it out that Andrew and I have known each other for a very long time. Um,
And we raced together on the
we
same
did.
team.
Yeah, we raced together on the same team. We even went to the same high school.
I know. Yeah. So we know all each other's cycling mistakes, and today on this podcast exclusive, we will expose them. So, but before we get into all of that, we have a couple of announcements. The first of which is that Frank wants you all to know that you should ride with us during the Sweet Spot Saturday Base Ride series on Zwift. Join coaches Frank and Jake each week for a focused Sweet Spot ride on Zwift. We'll target a specific kilojoule goal to achieve our daily base training and keep things social with a dedicated Discord channel and in game chat. By working together, we'll help each other tick off the KJs and make time fly by. Expect the ride to be 2.25 to 3 watts per kilo on the flats. And when you're sweet spotting on the climbs, you'll be doing 3 to 4.5 watts per kilo. The front group will always wait at the top to regroup so we can all roll to the next climb together. Interested? Just head to the Zwift companion app and search for the FasCat Club. It's free to join and a lot of fun. I won't see you there, but Jake and Frank will. And before we get started, we also have the review of the week, which comes to us from Adam P., titled Fastest I've Been After 30 Years of Racing. That's impressive.
Nice.
He says, the best thing I found about having a coach, besides scalping new PRs, is not having to question what I was doing. So much data creates so much stress. Hand it all over to the ones who spent years studying the science for a living to make you faster. Sierra has a fresh approach and knows how to tailor your specific training to your racing because she is out there doing it herself. Thanks, Adam, and
Nice.
congratulations on the 30-year PRs. That's awesome. Um, so anyway, let's get into this topic. So what I wanted to discuss tonight is how to plan the optimal race calendar for 2025 or any year. And so typically when I'm working with a client and I'm planning their race calendar or helping them develop a good race calendar, the thing I always want to start with is your A races. So Ricky, how many A races can someone have? How far apart should they be? Is this also where you start when you're talking to clients?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things like we first look at is like what discipline is this athlete in? Because it's going to really differentiate how many kind of peaks we could possibly have and how many races we can fit within those peaks. Um, I think let's just say the traditional road athlete, like we could fit a lot more racing in there just because the demands of like the single day of racing might be a lot less than say a gravel racer. If a gravel racer is doing Unbound and their day is going to be 12 hours long, that's a massive day. It's a ton of stress. And the biggest thing is it takes a ton of recovery to come back. You compare that to maybe someone who's doing road where their races might only be an hour and a half to 3 or 4 hours. Way less overall strain, way less fatigue, quicker recovery, cyclocross, track, anything like that, mountain bike XC. It's just you can fit a lot more racing in there. So when we kind of look at A races, yeah, start with what are you doing? What type of racing are you doing? How many races do you realistically want to do and what makes sense? And what do you really want to be good for? And I think that's the biggest thing is sometimes athletes don't know. They're like, I want to be good for, Unbound and Crusher and Leadville, but like I also want to be good for Sea Otter in the spring, and I want to do a crit the weekend after I do Unbound, where it's like, okay, that's not realistic. Like, let's take a step back. What I always have my athletes do is I say, send me whatever, an Excel sheet, something with every single race that you could possibly want to do. And that doesn't mean every single one that we will do, but every single one that you want to do. And then we kind of define it from there. And I can tell them, this doesn't make sense because it's too close proximity to X, or this is a completely different training than this race. So that's usually how I approach it. What about you?
Yeah, definitely similar. It definitely depends on the discipline. But regardless of that fact, I try and encourage my athletes to really define two periods or races of the year where they want to have their absolute best performance. And that's going to dictate what their periodization looks like. And as you pointed out, you can't be good all the time, right? You can't be your best all the time. Maybe you can be pretty
Mhm.
good all the time. And so, one of the questions in my mind, and one of the things that I see athletes try and do is say, okay, I want to peak for Unbound in June, and then I want to peak again in July.
Yeah.
And as you and I both know, that's not really possible, right? So, do you have I guess, like a timeline in your head for how much time you need between two peak performances?
Yeah, so I was just actually having this conversation today with an athlete. Um, I think it's always a lot easier when we come into that first peak of the season because we have the entire base season that could start in September, even, or October, November. Like, let's just say it starts in October, November. Like, we are able to put in 2 to 3 4 week base blocks. And then ideally, two 4 week builds. Depends on the event, kind of how we do it. But let's just say we do 3 4 week base blocks. That's 12 weeks. Another 8 weeks of building. You're looking at 20 weeks, and then maybe let's play around with 2 weeks for a taper. Like that's a lot of time, and realistically, we can only do that for the first peak of the season. But you've already created that foundation at that point. We don't need to do 12 weeks of base after that. So a lot of times, what I is ideal in, let's say, the second peak is to be able to at least go back and do 4 weeks of base. 6 weeks would be great. Um, 8 weeks would be better. I think it all just kind of depends on also how much rest you need to take. But, being able to, sorry if you can hear my dogs barking in the background, but yeah, I think if we're able to at least do 6 weeks, 4 to 6 weeks of base, and then go and maybe do 4 weeks of build would be kind of the minimum.
So you're saying 8 weeks is probably the minimum, and then maybe more would be even better. So,
Yeah.
like if you did your first peak, let's just say in May, maybe realistically you need to try and find an event in August or um, early September for maybe a second peak. If you really
Yeah,
want to have a true peak performance, yeah.
yeah, I think so. I think being able, I think that's one mistake some athletes, two mistakes really. I don't think they give themselves enough recovery after like a pretty big event. And sometimes, I mean, you could be looking at a week off the bike, sometimes even more. I mean, I've had unbound athletes take 2 weeks off, depending on how much fatigue they're kind of carrying. And kind of with that comes the aerobic fitness loss that we kind of need to go back and look at during a base period. So I think the athletes make a mistake of not giving themselves enough rest and then not going back to doing base. And whether that means just a
Totally.
lot of zone two, bigger volume, or doing sweet spot, tempo, longer intervals, it's really important to relay that foundation. Because if you just hop right back to intensity, like you're going to probably crumble well before you even get to your event.
Totally. Yeah, and I always talk about that in terms of the wheels falling off, meaning that aerobic base is no longer still there, right? And that's the foundation of everything else we do. So, you know, one of the biggest bummers I've ever experienced in myself and seen in, maybe athletes that are not taking that rest, not reinstilling that base after their first peak performance is that they they end up sort of both, you know, on one hand, like too fresh because, you're trying to rest them since they're seemingly really tired, but they're also tired because they never took a break. And it's just, it's the worst. Yeah. Nothing good comes out of that. So in order to prevent that, one thing that I suggest for the vast majority of my athletes is a mid-season break. And so what I mean by that is it's it's a lot different. It's shorter than, your traditional postseason break maybe, but at least a week totally off the bike. And yes, you're going to lose fitness during this period, but that doesn't matter because if you try and hold on to that fitness too long, that's when what I just described happens and the wheels fall off, right? So, do you have your athletes, Ricky, do a mid-season break, and if
I,
so, when?
Yeah, I usually do, and a lot of times we have that big first racing block taking place around that kind of April to May timeframe. So then, like, if we're able to, let's say, rest on the second half of May, um, and then we don't have an event till August, like that gives us like a little bit of May, all of June, all of July to kind of play with. So like, I think a lot of times, yeah, you'll kind of have athletes have their A event like in June, and it makes it a little bit tricky because it's like right in the middle of the season. Then it's
Hmm.
like,
Hmm.
okay, so kind of what do we do here? And there is, and I'll get your opinion on this. Like, we all know those athletes that just want to race a ton. Like, they're like, I have two gravel races in March, April, May, three gravel races in June. It's like, how do you approach that? Do you still give them that big rest and like tell them that there's going to be some races that they're not going to be as good for? And like, what do those races look like? And what does the training look like around those races?
Yeah, it's a really tough problem, and I think we're going to get into that in a second. But before we do, I think this is a good point to kind of jump into, our next task in creating the perfect calendar, which is filling in B and C races. So you've talked about these athletes that just want to race all the time, right? Maybe they have 10, 15, 20 more race days on their calendar. Um, and so my question for you is, um, how many B and C races is ideal? So not like how many races do you do a year, but
Mm-hmm.
as a coach, if you could kind of define the perfect calendar, how many B and C races would you want your athletes to do leading up to, their A event? And then,
Sure.
what's the purpose of those?
Yeah, no, that's a good one. And I think again it depends, on the athlete, but like let's just do gravel because I think we just have a lot of listeners that are really kind of diving deep into the gravel scene. So, you know, depending on the duration of the event you do too, whether it, is going to be a 200-mile race or a 150 or 100 or a 50, I think a lot of times these B and C races are actually really important to do a few things. They can serve as really good training. Like getting that kind of race stimulus in is something that's really hard to do outside of maybe a really fast group ride or some sort of fondo or something like that. So being able to get that intensity in, I think, is really important. But I always tell athletes, I'm like, do an event that's like low key, maybe a local one, something you don't have to travel for, to get the nerves out, because you don't want to hop into your biggest event of the year, having not done any racing because you're nervous, you haven't, ridden in a massive pack for a while. So I like to like sit with athletes and be like, okay, what is not going to be a massive stress that we can kind of plan in as a B or C race. And sometimes that might even mean if your big A race is going to be 100 or 150 miles, you do a 60 or 75-mile C race to not accumulate a ton of fatigue, but still get some race intensity in and get that kind of first race out of the way. So, let's just say in a first peak for a gravel athlete, maybe doing two C races, one B race, and an A race would usually be somewhat ideal. Like if their target is going to be unbound, having them do races that kind of almost build up to that distance, but are not all just like huge kilojoule days. Like, that would be probably ideal. So start small, build up, get the nerves out of the way, get some good training in, and, keep the stress low overall because you want to be pretty primed and ready to go when your A event rolls around.
Totally. Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And I think, especially for individuals that are newer to gravel, there's a lot of things that they're going to experience at their first gravel race, that you don't want to wait until your A race to experience those things. So it could be, finding your place in the start corral. It could be dealing with aid stations. These are things that you cannot really train for. They're things that you just have to have experience with, right?
Yeah.
So
I mean,
for
nutrition strategy, I think, is like one of the
totally.
biggest things that I'm like, you need to do the exact same thing you plan on doing for your A event. And if it doesn't work, then we know and we can make changes before your A event.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, well, and another thing too is like taking the timing out of things out of your hands, right? Or even the location where you're going to sleep, all these little
Mm-hmm.
things that you and I know really, really well from years of,
Mm-hmm.
of racing, might be new experiences for people. And you just kind of have to see how you do
Yeah.
under those circumstances. But another thing I wanted to touch on with B and C races is um, the difference between externally and more internally motivated athletes.
Hmm.
So there is maybe like, maybe it's 50-50. So let's just say, to make it easy, half of the population really needs that competition to kind of express their best performance. So for
Hmm.
those individuals, those B and C races can also be a good time to really just push themselves harder than they would on their own. And
Hmm.
not everybody needs that, but it sort of doesn't matter because there's still all those other points.
Yeah. Yeah, I
Um,
think for, like, a long time, I was one of those athletes that, like, loved to train. Like, I could train all year. But I think at a certain point, like, I mean, racing is fun, but I also learned at a certain point the value that you can get out of a race, and not just writing it off, being like, "Oh, it's training, I don't really care about it." Like, no, treating every race like it's important, and then getting, if you just have to mark it up as, oh, I'm getting a lot of fitness out of it and getting intensity that I wouldn't normally get, fine, that's great. But I think so much of it is just getting these little kind of intricacies out of it that you don't get training, and being around all those people, and being in that atmosphere. It's just totally different.
another thing that I like for it too is just it's sort of a not only like a form check, like relative to yourself, like, okay, this is an opportunity to test myself and see how my training is going, but I think it's also a good opportunity to just see how you stack up. So we as coaches can have a pretty good sense of how competitive an athlete is going to be based on, you know, their average speed on their training rides, or, past race experience, their watts per kilo, just their preparedness. Um, but I still think it's good for athletes to go out and experience, a field similar to the one that they're going to compete against at their big race, because I think
Hmm.
for everyone but the very fastest people, one of the hardest things about gravel racing is what I like to describe as finding your group.
Hmm.
So I think that's like kind of one of the most important things that's hard to learn on your own, is how do I filter myself into a group of other riders that are going to finish, in kind of a similar time to me, and then work with them such that, we can kind of maximize our speed out on the course, right? And
Right.
that's something that you just have to experience. And you and I know this, but I think a lot of people don't realize, um, I guess, two things really. Like, one, they kind of let their sort of emotions and their adrenaline get the best of them, and they
Hmm.
might kind of stay with the fast wheels or the faster wheels longer than
Yeah.
they should have. And
Yeah.
so, um, learning to sort of reflect in that first 20-30 minutes of racing, and calm down and assess, like, okay, like, do I just need to grunt this out and stay with this group and then it's going to get easier? Or should I pull the ripcord and kind of float back until I find my group?
Yeah.
And that's, I think, can be pretty make or break.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's another kind of big purpose for those. Um, and then the one last thing that I'll say kind of about the timing of BNC races is I kind of like for my athletes to have their first race, so maybe their C race, if we're talking about gravel,
Hmm.
maybe at the end of base three, I think is really good timing. They've already done
Yeah.
a little bit of intensity there. They've done some long rides. They have some volume in their legs, and it's a good opportunity to, I think, just go out and stretch the legs, see how you feel, feel those gains.
Yeah, I
And
always say,
then
like, I feel like right at the end of kind of base, like the way I describe it to athletes is like, you're probably going to not feel fast, but you'll feel strong, like, especially coming off of a lot of endurance, a lot of sweet spot. Like, you've got that, like, oh, I can, like, hit that kind of 80% of FTP forever kind of thing. You might not have that snap. And one of the most important things is that, like, high intensity to recovery, that lactate threshold that you kind of get as you build intensity, but you still can be competitive and get a lot out of those, even if you're not necessarily like fast per se.
Sure, sure. Yeah, and if you're following the heuristics that we're providing here, ideally you're doing, a more local, a lower pressure event as your C race. And so that's kind of bringing down the level of competition a little bit, unless you live somewhere that's just super super competitive. So the race should kind of meet you where you're at. It's hopefully not an event that you need to be on absolutely top form for to feel sort of competitive. So I think that's another nice thing.
Yeah.
And then do you to distinguish like B races and C races, what is the difference for you in the way that you plan those events? So like in terms of like tapering or just kind of how you put those in
Yeah,
a schedule.
I think it comes down. I mean, it can come down to the fact that maybe a race is a higher level race. Like, maybe it's just that these two races fall somewhat like close to each other. Um, but a lot of times it's more like it's the timing that it falls when you become a little bit fitter. You can be a little bit more competitive in those races, so it has a little bit higher level of importance to you. But I think a lot of times it just can come down to timing, and sometimes it's even hard to differentiate. Like, and maybe we can get into this, being able to almost hold a peak for two races and having them be in that close of proximity where you could almost like double race a peak, or whether something falls just far enough out, that it becomes a B race just by nature, because maybe you haven't really gone
Totally.
through a taper yet. Maybe you're still holding a little bit too much fatigue. Maybe you're missing just a little bit of the specifics, that you're going to be bringing into your A race. And yeah, I think C race is just really more of that dust the cobwebs off. You don't really have that pure race fitness yet. But yeah, B kind of blurs the lines between the two almost.
Totally. Yeah, and so we've already talked a little bit about like why for you as an athlete, B and C races are important, but they're also important for us as coaches as a tool. So what I mean by that is, um, to me as a coach, B races are important for my athletes to do because they're opportunities for me to help you refine your taper as well as your openers procedure. So, we as coaches have really good, like basic formats for those sorts of things. But in my experience, every athlete is a little bit different.
Mm-hmm.
So some athletes are going to do really good on super fresh legs. They need that. They need like a more aggressive taper to ride their best. Other athletes are just not going to ride that well in that scenario, and they need to come in, with a little bit more hard efforts in their legs. And I need to figure that out. If the athlete doesn't already know from their racing experience, maybe they're newer to racing, we need to kind of work that out together, and we want to have a low stakes chance to
Mm-hmm.
figure that out. Does
Yeah.
that align with your experience, Ricky?
Yeah, for sure. Like the taper's kind of a tricky thing. Like, let's just say on the long end, we could draw a taper out to 2 weeks almost. But some athletes, like, the weekend before, they need like actually a pretty big ride in them. And some of them, I would say, like the high volume, kind of like higher level, especially gravel athletes, need a pretty decent effort almost the week of to not bring them in too fresh. And yeah, I usually think like the kind of higher volume athlete, almost closer to that balance between freshness and fatigue, I take them into. But again, it really just depends. And like you said, I always have to tell athletes that I'm working with for the first time or I don't have a lot of historical data with them is I don't know exactly how you're going to respond. Um, I would think, maybe err on the side of taking them in fresher. I think it's always a safer bet, but you just don't know until you put them through that C and that B level race. And then, they might be like, man, the first hour of that race, like I was dragging. I just didn't feel like I could open up enough and be like, okay, like maybe we need to take you in with a little bit more fatigue than that.
Totally. Yeah. Yeah. So we have our A races outlined. We have our B and our C races on the calendar. We're in good shape here. Um, I always think the next step is setting goals for those A, B, and C races. So as we've already discussed, maybe your goal for your C race is just like get some experience, test out your legs. Maybe the goal for your B races is like let's get dialed. Like let's learn some lessons from that C race. Let's kind of do like a little mini taper, maybe just a couple days. Let's work on some openers and figure out under what conditions you're going to feel your best. But what I want to talk about here is setting goals for A races. I think that having a good goal is really important.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, what do you think, Ricky, makes a good goal? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, what does that look like?
Yeah. I think a goal like is almost like an umbrella because I think most athletes will go in and be like, I guess you have some of the athletes that like, I just want to finish, and it's like, okay, cool, and that's a great goal, because some of these races are hard as heck. But I think a lot of athletes are like, I want to be top five, or I want to be top 10, or I'm going to be top 20 in my age group, and like that's a very fine line, and that just leaves little margin for error, and it leaves the opportunity to be disappointed high. And so what I like to define with athletes is like, okay, let's just say the goal is top five. What are the goals underneath that umbrella to get you there? And like, I call them process goals, and they can be super simple, and they can be focusing on different points of the race. Like a lot of times, we all know how hectic that first hour of a gravel race is. Like a lot of times, the first goal of the race is nailing the first hour. Actually, it could start before that. Like it could be breakfast. An athlete
Yeah,
really struggles with getting their timing right for breakfast. Like that might be the first process goal in the route to a top five. And then it could be nailing, yeah, the first few miles of that race and getting to that crux point in good position. Because all of these little goals are leading to that bigger goal. And I think if you can almost compartmentalize it a little bit, you'll
hmm,
not focus on just that top five. You'll focus on like the route to get there. But I think a good goal has multiple steps to get there. And I think it also is not a pinpoint definition of what's going to make or break success, because I think a race can be successful if you don't exactly meet that top five or that age group goal. Um,
totally.
yeah, what about you?
Yeah, well, before I get into like my things, I just want to say like I really like what you said there, and it's definitely something I've used with my athletes and with myself. And I think just to make it explicit, the biggest benefit of having kind of a list of process goals is, to your point, Ricky, you can still have a successful race without a good result, right? Because
Because
there's a
things
lot of
can be
things
out of
that
your
can.
hands too. Yeah.
Right? You could drop your bottles. I mean, there's a lot of just crazy things that can happen out there. A train can come
Yeah.
across the tracks and the breakaway rolls away and it's got five dudes in it. Okay, you're not getting top five now. So, but if you've done everything right up until that point, then you can walk away from that event, I think, feeling accomplished. But
Hmm.
so, for me, what kind of goal we can set depends a little bit on whether or not the athlete has done the race before. So if you've never done the race before, I almost would prohibit you from having a results based goal because you just don't know how you're going to stack up against that
Hmm.
field. Um, you know, so many, different people could show up and the level of competition, it can be a big question mark, right? Like they don't publish start lists for gravel races a lot of times, so
Hmm.
it's just hard to say, and so it's really hard to kind of have a goal that's super appropriate for you, right? It's sort of like an arbitrary ego based goal is the way that I think of
Right.
it. Um,
And that's
time
when those
based goals,
execution goals can like really come in handy. Like if you don't know
yeah.
exactly how you're going to stack up for a result, it's like, okay, control what you can control then almost.
Totally. Yeah, and then another thing I hear from a lot of my athletes is like time-based goals. And I think time-based goals can be okay if the course is the same year to year, which it isn't always. So, Steamboat is an example of a race that's, between 23 and 24 was a different course, right? So
Hmm.
so you can't really, until you know exactly how chunky that course is and how it's going to feel, it's hard to have a time-based goal. And for races like Mid South or Unbound, not only does the course change year to year sometimes, or at least in the case of Unbound, but the conditions can vary wildly.
Hmm.
So, like, your time goal for a muddy year is not going to make sense for a dry year,
Right.
right? So something that I like to have for a lot of my athletes is like a power based goal. If those two kind of previous criteria haven't been met, so you've never done the race before, I say, okay, so we know what you're doing in training and we know what would represent like a good physical performance. Let's focus on that. And that's especially the case for athletes who are doing races where they may end up alone or they may end up being the fastest person in their group and doing a lot of the work.
Hmm.
I think if you're going to be in a more tactical situation, a power based goal doesn't make sense, right?
Yeah.
Because the goal then is to do the least power
Yeah.
potentially. Um, but I think those can be good goals. And there's process goals with that as well. So, one goal might be not going above a certain wattage in the first hour, right? It
Hmm.
kind of just, the goal then just becomes executing a good plan, executing a
Yeah.
good pacing strategy, right? So that definitely falls into the category of process goals as well.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
and that also has to be adjusted depending on, whether or not maybe the race is at altitude and you come from sea level. We need to kind of we know that you're not going to do your sea level watts up at altitude.
Hmm.
Or if you come from somewhere that's more of a cool climate and the race is going to be somewhere really really hot,
Yeah.
that's another factor. And so, for example, if the race was at altitude, we might have a really specific plan to prevent you from blowing up, right?
Hmm.
Because that's easy to do at altitude. If the race is going to be really hot, we might have a really specific goal around, keeping your core temp down or maybe getting enough hydration. So again, process goals tailored towards kind of the specific
Yeah.
conditions of the race.
And not to get too into the weeds about this, because this is almost more just like how to set up your training around your racing, but like using the examples of altitude and heat, I think most of our athletes, like once July and August rolls around, it's going to be pretty hot. Like if you're racing in the south, it's going to be pretty hot. And then altitude, our athletes that are doing the Leadvilles or the Crusher and the Tushers or the Rad, anything that's at altitude, like that has to be almost factored into, if not some of the B or C races, into the training. And that could affect the timing. It could affect the lead up. It could affect the recovery. I think that are non-acclimated athletes that are going to Leadville, like that drastically changes how you approach it and then how you leave that race too. You might need a completely different type of preparation for it. So just something to bear in mind. And I think that can affect B&C races. It can affect, how you do that transition into your next phase of racing. So always something I think to consider.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. That's a good thought. So one additional layer of all this that I like to kind of talk to my athletes about, we've already touched on this a little bit, is how your race goals maybe align with bigger season long goals.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so that's something that we have to make sure are in alignment. And so the example that I thought of is maybe you're trying to get an upgrade, right? Like maybe you're a cat 3, you really want to be a cat 2. Maybe you're trying to qualify for something, so you're doing like Leadville qualifier races, or you're trying to qualify for like road or cyclocross worlds. Those are goals where you need to get points, right? You need to
Yeah.
get like UCI points to qualify. So um any thoughts on like how to balance those things, or maybe even you just have like an example that comes to mind, and how that example would kind of affect what we've talked about so far?
I've got like two examples there. I think the Leadville one is always really tricky, um, because you want to get the best corral possible. It makes such a huge difference, and you've got a lot of races along the way, and some of them are close to you, some of them are like a pretty big travel. So like they're going all the way back to like, okay, if I'm trying to qualify for Leadville 2025, I could be racing in 2024 at Austin Radler, trying to get points at the end of the season, having to maybe even try to have a third peak during the season super late, because now I know that Leadville 2025 is a massive goal. But let's just say I don't get what I wanted out of there, then I have to look at further races. I have to look at like Tahoe 50. I have to look at Lutzen 99. And then it gets even trickier if you don't get those. And then you've got Silver Rush, which is a very demanding race. And then now the Leadville stage race, which is 3 weeks before Leadville. So I've actually, in past years, I've actually had a lot of athletes use either Silver Rush or Leadville Stage Race as like a big B race, or sometimes for Leadville Stage Race, almost an A race, because it can make a
Yeah.
difference leading up to it. So I think in the past few years, like the Leadville Stage Race has provided athletes that opportunity to preview the course in a way that has less fatigue, almost because it's broken up into shorter 3-day stages of the whole thing. And it actually can work out really well, but it can also create a lot of fatigue. If you're not acclimated, it's probably not a good idea. If you are acclimated, you live in Colorado, it might be something you can do. Same goes for Silver Rush. Like I've had athletes trashed. And then like let's take another example, road. You and I both know this. Like let's say you're trying to get that Cat 2 to Cat 1 upgrade. Everyone comes out in January and February at all-time peak fitness. They've just been doing 25 hours a week from November to December to January. And they want to do Valley of the Sun, Tucson Bicycle Classic. Like in our days, it was like San Dimas. Like those were the three races where you could accumulate enough points to get your upgrade. But what happens after that? It's a huge, massive block. You're running 110 CTL, and then what are you going to do? You're going to take 2 weeks off, and then you have Redlands and Gila and Joe Martin and Nationals. But you've sacrificed those the goal was to be able to do Joe Martin, Gila, Redlands, and Nationals by being a Cat 1, but you sacrificed it by getting all the upgrade points. So you have to kind of determine, is this a multi-year goal? Is Redlands
Right.
2025 the goal? So I came out really hot in 2024. But if you're like, no, I want to get my Cat 1 upgrade, I'm going to do these massive races, I'm going to come in at peak fitness, then you have to adjust your expectations. You're not going to be able to hold that peak through the end of June. It's just not realistic. So I think
Totally.
having as much time as possible to take that macro view and look at it. And I think sometimes it's hard to get athletes to buy into it, but sometimes it's a multi-year process. You can't have everything all in one year. You have to maybe make sacrifices this year to achieve things next year.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and to kind of speak to both of those examples, um, I like what you said about, maybe this is more of a 2-year goal, right? So, like, if you want to do Leadville, for example, you're going to do the Leadville Stage Rush or Silver Rush 50. You're there's a good chance that you're not going to be on peak form for both of those things. And Leadville is not the sort of event that you want to go to not on your best legs.
Yeah.
So, I would even almost go so far to say that unless you're going to get your qualifier done earlier in the year, so at Sea Otter or Lutsen 99er, that would be your A event. That would be your first, kind of peak, and then your second peak could be Leadville. But if it's later than that and you're not from altitude and you can't do this kind of with minimal, fatigue associated with it, yeah, maybe this is more of a 2-year endeavor. And
Hmm.
then in the case of the upgrade thing, the thing that I've experienced with a lot of my athletes is, they really want to get their upgrade. We get them to kind of peak form, and then I just have them, race their brains out. Right? I'm like,
Yeah.
okay, we're on peak form. We got lightning in the bottle right now. Like, let's just do as many local races as we can because you're just going to win all of them, and we're going to get a ton of upgrade points. But to your point, Ricky, there's a consequence to this, right?
Yeah.
If you do this, if you kind of stretch that peak out, after 2, 3 weeks, maybe, yeah, you can't have an A race the week after that. It's just not going
Yeah.
to happen. You need to take a break, or at least kind of like go back to training. Reinstill that aerobic base, and then plan for another A race later in the year once you've had that,
Hmm.
let's say 12 weeks to kind of rest and then rebuild. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, yeah. Anyway, interesting stuff. So the next thing on my list is, what is the optimal number of races? And so we've talked about this a little bit already. And so the first point I have down here that you already mentioned is, well, it depends on the discipline.
Yeah.
A second point that I have down here that we haven't talked about yet is it depends on travel, right? So if you have to travel for all of your races, the optimal number of races to do in a year, um, like it really needs to come down because traveling is not without consequence. I would say like
Yeah.
traveling is an opportunity to get sick. It's expensive. It usually involves, um, missing a training day, and I almost don't consider big travel days where you're in the car for more than a few hours or you get on an airplane recovery days. So you
No
might
way.
actually need like an additional recovery day after you get back. So
Yeah.
that's a couple of days missed.
I mean, it sounds
Um,
silly, but I mean, East Coast to West Coast and vice versa, like that's jet lag. Like that's four
oh yeah.
hour time difference. Like that's not nothing. And if you're going to Europe, like that's huge. That's like a ton of fatigue. So yeah, you have to think about that.
Yeah. So, let's just go down the list of, disciplines, and maybe it'll be hard to generalize, but for gravel, like, what do you think the optimal number of races would be? Like if
Yeah.
you define for your athletes what their schedule is, how many
Yeah.
times would you have them race?
Well, here's the funny thing, like, I think most of the time we're talking about limiting athletes to not doing too many races, but the opposite can be said. If you are only doing 1 or 2 races in the entire year, and again, this is why we'll talk about B and C races become important. If you have just 1 race, and let's say you're not gonna do anything else, you're just gonna do a race in April and a race in August, it's everything. All your eggs are in that basket. And then what if something goes wrong? Like what if you have one A event in the entire year and you get sick that week? Then is your entire season ruined? It's like that sucks. So there's almost you need to have enough races that you can have contingency plans. And life happens and sometimes things don't work out, so you need to be able to adjust. So let's just say for a gravel athlete, I think ideally 2 big A races, sometimes 3. I think if you're starting early enough and finishing late enough and you can hold motivation, 3 is acceptable, but like 2 is ideal. And then I think having 2 to 3 B and C races, combined, like maybe 2 C races and 1 B. So let's like call that 6 races in a year if you were to do a
Yeah.
double peak with 2 A races. So I would say maybe minimum of 4 races, maybe maximum of 10, depending on how short the races are and what your fitness level, how long you've been doing it for.
Right.
What about you?
Yeah. Yeah, well, I have kind of a slightly different criteria that makes this a little bit less general. And I didn't afford you the same criteria, so
Okay.
I apologize for that. But with respect to what you just said, one thing I'll add is um, I think like how many gravel races you do depends on your volume in
Hmm.
part, right? And this is assuming that you're racing like big, really long gravel races. And to kind of put some specific numbers to it, if you're not regularly doing 5 hour rides and like pretty well adapted to that, and all your races are 5 plus hours, those are going to fatigue you more.
Yeah.
They're going to come at a higher cost than an athlete who's used to doing that as just part of their normal training, right? Um, but then in general, I would say my biggest criteria for defining how many races an athlete should do is you know what's limiting your performance. And what I mean by that is we've all had athletes, we've all known athletes who are just super super strong but like god awful at racing. Those folks, like their time, like if the goal is race performance, their time, they don't need to get stronger maybe. Like their time is better spent like gaining experience and picking up skills.
Hmm.
Whereas there's athletes that are on the flip side that are maybe like really technically adept racers. Like maybe they're really really good at bike handling. They come from a mountain bike background, they're doing gravel races. That's not a limiter, but maybe they don't have great fitness. And it's funny, like usually athletes kind of separate themselves into like one or the other category, because if you were amazing technically and just stronger than everybody else, you would just be a pro, right?
Yeah.
That's like what being a pro is. So I think that's kind of like the delineating factor for me. And I don't want to pigeonhole anyone. Of course, there's people out there who are like so at both, or really good at both, or really bad at both. But that's kind of how I like help an athlete decide how many times they should be racing.
Yeah, and just to like give a quick like anecdote to that, like there are some like Iowa actually has this amazing just series, and they're pretty like grassroots low key, but there's like 10 of them. It's the Iowa Gravel Series, and most of them are 100K, so like 62 miles. And I've got an athlete who can handle big volume. He can do 100, 150 mile races, but we did want to work on those race skills, so we just had him like boom do. He was doing them like twice a month. And, that lower volume, lower kind of, not actually the intensity was high, but the lower volume enabled him to be able to recover quickly. And so, he's a gravel athlete that might have 16 race days, so yeah.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing that we haven't talked about yet either, actually, is how competing in a series affects your periodization. So, a lot of times with the athletes I work with a lot of cyclocross athletes. Maybe they don't care about the state championships or nationals. They wanna win their series.
Hmm.
Within that scheme, you almost don't get to have an A race. We
Yeah.
can taper for the last race of the season, but if you want to be good from the beginning of the series in September all the way to the series end in December, you've sort of forfeited your ability to have like a true peak, or at least as high of a peak, I guess I should say. You can still peak and have like a great performance at the end, but it's not going to be as high as if you were willing to sacrifice some of those early races. And
Yeah,
I think unless you're just hands down the best, if you're competing in a season long series, this could even apply to lifetime GP athletes. Um, you need to be really good every time you show up
yeah.
because you can't really afford to have a bad performance. So,
Yeah. Yeah, and I think, I mean, not to get too far off here, but like I think that does apply a bit more to our road athletes because I think a lot of
mhm,
them want to just be pretty darn good throughout the entire year. I think naturally we create some peaks and some valleys just depending on like when we're able to get a lot of volume in, maybe due to weather. But like especially I think a lot of my U23s, my juniors, like racing is super important. And so we just have to keep them at a pretty good fitness level all year and do like I just call them yeah, like micro breaks where we're doing 3 days off or something like that. And we do it a
mhm,
little bit more frequently. But yeah, I think the series also you kind of let's just take maybe something like Lifetime, like cyclocross, it's not like an athlete is going to vastly differ at which race they're going to be good at and which race they're going to be bad at based on skill or ability. But something like Lifetime, you might have to be like, well, I really excel at altitude. So it's like you have to
right,
put your eggs into that basket sometimes and be like, okay, maybe I'm really not great at handling, so maybe I have to sacrifice sea otter, but then I'm going to put my eggs into like the Leadville basket because I know I can do really well
right.
there. So, just
Yeah.
another thought.
Yeah, so there's a lot of layers to this, which
Yeah.
is which is cool. It's a cool, I think, puzzle for us to try and solve. But
Hmm.
um, the next thing I have down here on my list is classic calendar mistakes, and so we've already talked about some of these things. So top of my list was too many races, right?
Yeah.
People who basically never get to train, that can be a bad thing. Too few races, Ricky, you talked about that. Um, I have one down here that we haven't talked about yet that I think is kind of a thing I see more often than I'd expect, which is having races on your calendar that are too dissimilar. So,
Mm-hmm.
I know a lot of road athletes. I coach a lot of road athletes, and I cannot tell you how many times I've had athletes wanting to do, let's say, Unbound in Tulsa.
Yeah. Yeah.
Which is like you can do both, like, right? But if you're gonna do Unbound, your goal probably shouldn't be Tulsa or whatever
Yeah.
the race the weekend after it is, because one, the recovery demands of doing an event like Unbound, and two, like the training that you're gonna do to be good for Tulsa is not gonna make you good for Unbound, and vice versa. So
Yeah. It's
I
like, which one do you really want to be better at? And like, if you're doing something like Unbound, like I hate to say it, like that's you can't do crit training and then be good at Unbound. You're more likely to be able to train for Unbound and get in a ridiculous amount of volume and be way more on the or the aerobic side and be okay at Tulsa. But like you're never going to be amazing at both. I mean, I've had athletes in a similar thing where I think they lean or skew more towards the gravel side of things, but they want to do a few crits here and there. And I'm like, okay, like that's something we can work in, but like you're going to be a little bit flatter. That's like how your physiology is going to be, and your fitness is just not going to be specific to the demands of a crit. But it does make it tough for us coaches because we do like get that all the time. Like yeah, I'm gonna do this 200-mile gravel race, and then like I've got track nationals like the next week, and it's like
no.
nobody.
Well, so the flip side of that, just as an example of like dissimilar events that I think could actually make for a really good calendar, is if you have some low pressure, low priority gravel races, maybe in your early spring, like kind of like we talked about the end of your base season, leading up to like an XCO calendar or a crit calendar. I think that can work really, really well. And to speak to my personal experience, when I was on teams that were doing the stage races in the spring, you do Valley of the Sun, Joe Martin, Gila Redlands. Um, you know, those. those summers were some of my best crypt performances, and I would attribute it to, getting those big volume stage races in, getting like that extended, you know, speed stimulus, from those races where you're just kind of cruising around in the pack at 30 miles an hour all day. Like that was really good for my fitness. And so I think, if you're, a crit dog, or, you race any sort of short duration discipline, like you can still race gravel, but I
Yeah.
think it just has to coincide well with your periodization.
Yeah. I mean, there's no substitute for volume. I mean, no two ways around it. Like volume and aerobic work is gonna almost always help you. And so
Yeah.
I think that's definitely true. If you can almost make that gravel block as just this huge aerobic kind of cycle, then you've already got the foundation like set up, and then you can build on top of that pretty well.
Yeah. Yeah. And there's a lot of athletes out there that would, for whatever reason, psychologically, it's easier for them to do a 5 or 6 hour gravel race than it is for them to do a 5 or 6 hour training ride.
Hmm.
And I would count myself as one of those people. All of my longest rides, all my 7 8 hour rides have been in races,
Yeah.
not on my own.
Yeah.
So if that sounds like you, then putting some events on your calendar that are really long might be a kind of a sneaky way to get you to do the training you need to do.
Hmm.
Yeah. So here's a personal question for you, Ricky. As a pro rider, do you get to have A races? Are you allowed to peak, or do you fall into that camp of you just have to be good all the time because that's your job?
Yeah, it's super tough. Like, I would say that most of the time I can't. I can pick like very small times where I can be pretty good, but most of the time I just have to be decently good. Like, you take my common, calendar. Usually I would be leaving next week to go race in Spain. It like big UCI races, and then doing some dot pros in February. So it's like, yeah, you have to be good. Like I can't afford. I'm not good enough to just like train through those. I need to be pretty good there, and it just so kind of happens that like, okay, then I come back to the United States. And maybe I have some important goals there. Maybe it's Redlands or Gila. Like I want to do well GC. A lot of times, like the fitness that I've accumulated has been good enough that I can get by here and be pretty darn good. Um, but I would say usually for me, the second half of the season is where I can be a bit more pinpoint about where I want to be really good. So yeah, let's take 2024 for instance. Started in Spain in late January. Like you got to be good. I raced through March in Europe, and so again, pretty darn good fitness, but like let's say pretty flat line. I wasn't doing a lot of training. I was mostly racing and recovering. Maybe had 2 3 weeks training camp, kind of that's the only bit of training I did. Maybe like call it for like 7 to 10 days of training, and then another 6 week block of racing, and then it's like that June period. I could take a week, 10 days off, or just do some really light riding, do some big blocks, and then tour Portugal. I was able to like I knew that was one I wanted to be really good for, and so I was able to then like really kind of ramp my training into it, do a proper base cycle again, had all this racing already under my belt, and then come into that feeling really good.
Yeah, yeah, and I think everybody's different in that regard, but that's cool perspective.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, and to kind of just like put a bow on this calendar kind of discussion, I hate to say this, but it all depends, right? It all
Yeah.
depends on the individual. It all depends on your goals, and training can be the perfect racing, or I'm sorry, racing can be the exact training that you need to be your best, or maybe you need to do training that's not racing, right, to
Yeah.
get your best. So
Yeah.
I think everybody's a little bit different, and that's why it's important, I think, to um, work with a coach who can kind of just be an extra set of eyes, and maybe see something that you don't. Um, but if you are self-coached, then you just have to plan and be willing to adjust, I think, right? And I think it unfortunately these days you have to sign up for a lot of these races way in advance. But I
Mm-hmm.
think something that's important is being willing to drop races off of your calendar if things don't go according to plan, or if you feel a certain way, or if you check a certain box early. Um, and I think it's also sometimes important to like be willing to add races to your calendar. So I
Yeah.
think it's good to kind of have an overarching plan, but you need to stay flexible.
And I think, yeah, again, like with the self-coached athlete, it's like you got to be honest with yourself. And I think hopefully this podcast will help a little bit at understanding what you need between races, especially how much time you actually need to be good and how many races you realistically can be good. And I think a lot of athletes have never experienced like what a peak can really feel like. A lot of times because they're overtrained, sometimes because they're undertrained. But like when you kind of have that first peak where you're like, wow, I'm faster than I've ever been, you kind of understand a little bit better the entire process that goes into doing it again. So, like, yeah, use some of the little tidbits from this, like, into your training if you're self coach and just be honest with yourself. And, like, you know, the Coach Cat app, like, you can plan in that rest. Like, it'll know how much recovery you probably need. So, like, don't try to think you're smarter than your coach or the app.
Yeah, yeah, definitely. Well, and one other thing that came to mind while you were talking there, Ricky, is this classic scenario where you maybe do your B race and you don't have the performance you wanted to have there.
Hmm.
I think most people who are ambitious, their instinct is, okay, I need to be fitter to have the performance I want to have. I need to train even harder. I need to do even more volume. I think something to be aware of is that sometimes that is the case, but I think oftentimes the key to getting faster might be resting. So I just wanted to kind of illuminate, just shed some light on that trope.
Well, I think this will segue well into we wanted to talk a little bit about like mistakes that we've personally made because I think Andrew and I have like run the spectrum from like young aspiring pros to jaded, ex pros. I guess I'm still racing, but I think what you're talking about that like you're close to your race, you have a bad race, um, and then you're like, well, maybe I didn't do enough. Like that's the biggest mistake you can make. Like what I always tell athletes, it's like
Totally.
we can always add on a bit more. We can't take it back once you've done it. So like you have to understand too that during some of these C and B races, it might be by design that you don't feel great. And it also
Right.
goes into that like magical feeling of the peak. Like a lot of times it's that extra rest that comes after that B race as you taper in, like as you're feeling nervous that you're not doing enough. Like that's when the magic happens. And the 9.9 times out of 10 you don't need any more work. You've done enough and maybe you were just fatigued by design during that race. So like again, try to look at it objectively. Like even as a coach, I have trouble sometimes as an athlete, like getting over that. But just if you have to make an assumption, just rest.
Yeah, yeah, that's definitely the safer of
Yeah,
the two choices. So yeah, let's finish up real quick with this last segment. We thought we would just talk a little bit about mistakes we made when we were younger, and even like mistakes that we see young athletes make now. And so at the top of my list is just totally crushing oneself over the winter. And what I mean by that is doing too much because you're just so hungry and you're so motivated.
yeah,
And you can become a better rider over the course of your winter. But the thing that I always really caution against is using up all of your, what I like to call mental marbles, doing
yeah,
these Mondo rides on the trainer, right? And the framework that I'm kind of thinking about here is like you only have so much motivation and mental energy within a year as a
yeah,
whole. So if you're still just in like base one or base two, unless you're an endless well of motivation, really pushing yourself to do endless hours on the trainer is maybe not the best thing to do because down the road, when it comes time for VO2 max work, you kind of might be tapped out.
yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I think to kind of add to that, like I don't have a direct number, but like the percentage, like the trainer's not the same as riding outside. It takes more out of you. Maybe it's mental, but there's something about it. Like if you're just doing 20, 25-hour weeks on the trainer, like it's too much. I'm just gonna say it's too much. Just stop. Just don't do it. But no, but in all seriousness, I think like we have so much motivation and we're just so stoked and we just want to put everything into like proving that we're good right away. But it's a long season. No matter who you are, what racing you're doing, there's a whole lot of racing. And I would always rather be undercooked than overcooked going into the season. Um,
Totally.
and
Yeah,
I
you got
think
to be patient.
yeah. And like I said, it also is like the amount of base you can do, before the spring is just so much more than you can do during the season. So like I think athletes tend to do that, 0.75 IF for their big long rides all the time, and they're accumulating so much stress that they just do too much. So, back it off a few.
Yeah.
I took two
You,
off seasons this year. I took two separate 2 week breaks, and then I took another 1 week break. It's
yeah.
and
Look
I'll
at you go. You're doing
yeah
amazing.
yeah, there you go.
So
Um,
yeah, what other mistakes do you have, Ricky, that maybe you made or you saw me make when we were young?
I mean, I don't know, I think you were a bit more calculated than I probably was, even younger. I mean, I definitely fell into the category of like the weight obsession, like the watts per kilo. At first, we all just see everyone as being super skinny, and we just think that like if you're skinny, it means you go uphill fast. But nowadays, you're actually seeing a lot of big dudes going uphill pretty fast. And you want to know what? Like, yeah, they might be 75 kilos and they're just freaking strong. And I think when I was first starting, I was like, I had no concept of nutrition. I didn't have anyone to ask about it. So I didn't know. All I knew was like, oh, if you're skinny, you'll be fast. And so I was underfueled, under recovered. My muscles literally were not getting, the fuel and recovery they needed. So I'd get injured all the time. And then I'd have crap years. Like I might, and I think a lot of people that do these kind of drastic weight cuts, like there's the moments where you feel pretty good and you go pretty fast and it gives you a false sense that like, oh, this is good, but it only lasts for a week or two. I would almost always err on athletes being a couple kilos heavier and having more power. If it was, I
Right.
mean, I eventually over the years like learned about nutrition, learned about proper race weight, found the race weight for me that works, and now I'm at the point where I don't have to try that hard to be at race weight. Um, but I think the one thing I took away was like, yeah, being a few kilos heavier is always going to be worth it.
Yeah.
You won't get sick as easily. Like there's so much that just being healthier makes such a big difference.
Well, and some of this is like a generational mistake, right? So it wasn't obviously just us. It was like everybody that we were looking up to at the time. I think nobody back then had good insight into the optimal fueling. We've seen everything swing completely the other way. And that's a big part of like why uh yeah, we see all these bigger, more powerful riders these days, but we also see, people doing unprecedented power and people doing unprecedented speeds in these races, right? And another thing to think about too is like just because you're skinny doesn't necessarily mean that you should try and be a climber, right? Like that might not be your phenotype or your destiny. And even if you did want to be a climber, you have to really consider like what events you aspire to do and whether or not being a great climber is even conducive to that. So if you're, an aspiring road racer in the US, and you just want to get as far as you can with the sport, a good way to show yourself would probably you'd probably be better off being like a really good all-rounder. And maybe you're a little heavier but you're more well-rounded because a lot of the US road calendar is not super climbing heavy, right?
Okay, so I think like for me, I have to be um, pretty. I have to really think about where I want to put my energy into racing and what races I can really excel at because just by like physiology, I am not able to put on, extra kilos and have a ton of extra power. For me, it's just kind of like I found my optimal weight and it just kind of enables me to have a higher watt per kilo, and that's what I kind of had to focus on. So yeah, it's like it's hard in the US. I would love to be 5 kilos heavier and have 75 extra watts on my FTP, but I just can't have that. So I have to focus on the Gilas, the Redlands, certain stages. And for most of the people, yeah, if you can be an all rounder, you're gonna just have a way better opportunity to get results across the board. And I think the same really goes for gravel. I think like for gravel, like yeah, you might do a really climbing heavy race, but like having the ability to put out power for longer periods of time is way more important than having a good 20-minute watt per kilo.
Totally. Yeah, and that kind of rolls into like my last point here, I think, which is um, a mistake I think I see a lot of people make is pigeonholing themselves, especially when they're really young and they're still developing. I think until you're maybe out of U23s or until, let's say, for older folks, you have a few years of racing under your belt. Don't define what type of rider you are. Like, be
Yeah,
willing to try different things, and you never want to tell yourself, um, "Oh, I can't do X because I'm Y," right? So, I'm kind of more of a sprint type athlete, and I think leaning into that too much has held me back a lot in my so-called career, right? Where I think if I had been a little bit more open-minded and more confident in my other abilities, who knows what could have happened. But yeah, I just think that it's really important to not limit yourself, and if you're young in particular, I think you should try just a ton of different stuff.
for
Yeah,
sure. I know so many really good sprinters that are like 65 kilos, like small guys,
totally,
and they just like have the physiology to have a lot of pop, or they just are really good bike racers and they can put themselves in the right place at the right time. Um,
totally.
so yeah, totally agree with that.
Yeah, yeah, and to kind of put a bow on Ricky's point there, yeah, don't let the way that you look define what phenotype of rider you are, right? So Ricky talked about, he's a more slight guy. So the card that he plays is high watt per kilo, which really works well for him and works with his physiology. But to his point, just because he's skinny doesn't mean that he's not a sprinter, right? So, I would say, just forget all of the classic tropes of how different types of riders should look,
Hmm.
because that's not really what defines it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
for sure. Great point.
Yeah. Sweet, man.
That was a good one. Well, since Andrew did the intro, I'll finish it up here with a few sage words. At FasCat, we are obsessed with making your cycling training fun, effective, and flexible. And we give you two ways, we can do that. Andrew and I, one-on-one coaches. That's what we do. You can sign up for a free consult with one of us, and we will let you talk our ear off. And then we, of course, have the Coach Cat app with AI coaching that, it's going to give you good stuff. It's not going to be you're not going to be able to chit chat with it as much as Andrew and I, but the Coach Cat app I think is a really great way if you're on a little bit more of a budget and you want really cost-effective training. It's a really good way to do it. So, your goals plus our expertise mean more fun, more flexibility, and more improvement in 2025. You can start following a free custom training plan today. No credit card required, or fill out our new athlete questionnaire for a no risk complimentary coaching consultation.
Heck yeah. Thanks,
All
Ricky.
right. Thanks, man. Pleasure.